A few years ago, a movie came out called Red Tails, telling the story of the Tuskegee pilots during World War II. The fighter plane animations may have been a little over the top, as Dr. Brown remembers telling George Lucas at a private showing, but the courage they faced overcoming discrimination and the legacy they created is more real than any movie could ever portray.
When we came under your command, Colonel, you stated very clearly that we would never find Negroes who could pass a pilot's exam, make it through flight school, survive basic combat. We've done all of that.
What we do, how well we do it, does it matter?
And you all thought what?
You'd sign up, and that'd be the end of 100 years of bigotry. Get your head up, son. You're fighter pilots.
We have a right to fight for our country, the same as every other American. We will not go away.
I can't afford the kind of losses my bombers have been suffering.
Can you help save lives?
We can help your boys.
Nothing's difficult.
Everything's a challenge.
Through adversity to the stars.
From the last plane to the last bullet to the last minute to the last man, we fight.
We fight.
We fight.
We fight.
We fight.
We fight.
At all costs, you protect the heavies.
Fighters, 4 o'clock. Stay with the bombers.
One bomber, that's 10 men. We count our victories by the bombers we get to their targets. By the husbands we return to their wives. By the fathers we get back to their children.
When we first met Harold, he shook each of our hands and asked us, "What do you want to do? What's your passion? You think you can fly?" We could hardly keep up as Dr. Brown led us to one of his favorite rooms.
This picture over here is a picture of my brother and I. We had just come back from the war. My father, of course, is over on the left. He was in World War I. And my mother is on the right. That's my brother, sitting on the right. He was 5 years older than I was. His experience in the military was so different from mine. I was a pilot, an officer. I could fly a mission, come back home, take a hot bath, have a good meal, and have nothing to do maybe the next day. But I would fly a mission the next day. Where he was flying, he was constantly on the front lines, living in all the dirt, the grime, and so forth, with the ground troops. So he led an entirely different life than what I led. Granted, yeah, I faced an enemy when I flew a mission, but I also came home and slept in a nice warm bed and had a nice beautiful steak after I flew my mission. 2 entirely different lifestyles.
Harold was born in Minneapolis in 1924, and he says that it was in 6th grade when he made this life discovery.
That was the time when I fell in love with an airplane. And from that point on, it was nothing but airplanes. I built models, read all the books I could find. I was determined to become a pilot. Now, it just so happened that back in those days, they wouldn't let guys that looked like me fly airplanes. Well, bottom line was they felt we weren't capable, weren't intelligent enough to learn how to fly. And there's a lot of other stuff, but that was a basic reason why. When I was in 1941, I was a soda jerk, and I saved up $35, and I went down and took flying lessons. That got me 5 flying lessons. I thought I could raise another $35 so I could continue my flying lessons, but I couldn't.
There was no opportunity for a person of color to become a pilot unless he could pay for private lessons. He could never become a pilot at the amount of time it would take for him to save.
Well, actually, it took me just about 18 months. But do you know what that $35 would be worth today? How about $745 today? When I talk to youngsters, I usually ask them, "And you guys got $745 in your pocket?" That's what I had in my pocket, was the equivalent of $745 that I had saved up when I took flying lessons.
Flying for the military would be the only way he could afford becoming a pilot. He wasn't going to give up on his dream, and not even his mom could stop him.
Ma, I'm going to become a pilot. I'm not going to practice the piano anymore. And she looked at me as if I had lost my mind. As a matter of fact, that's almost what she said. Boy, are you crazy? I said, no, Mom, this is what I want. Get on that piano stool. She finally came around and said, okay, Harold, if that's what you want to do, okay.
The U.S. Army would not train blacks to become pilots, but he just believed that by the time he graduated, things would work itself out.
So I graduated from high school at 17, went down, set for the exams, passed them.
In 1939, the military started a civilian pilot training program to have pilots readily available in the event of war. No black man was allowed to serve or be trained in the U.S. military until June of 1941, when President Roosevelt signed an executive order to end discrimination in the military. And this allowed for the 13 candidates to be the first of the Tuskegee Airmen.
6 months later, I heard from Washington, D.C. that I had been selected. I finished my program in May of 1944. A little second lieutenant, 19 years old, thought I was the greatest thing that ever said good morning to an airplane.
President Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, came to visit Tuskegee in July to see how things were going. Harold was still finishing high school at the time, but remembers hearing the story well.
So she comes, she says, well, how is the program going? And she was referring to, she thought that we were all in military flight training. So she comes out to the field to meet Alfred Anderson, and they said, no, this is the civilian pilot training program. They still will not accept us to go into military flight training. Now, that was back then. Well, she talked to the Alfred Anderson and asked Alfred Anderson to take her up for a ride. And a little Piper Cub, which was the same club, the same kind of airplane I took my first flying in, a little tail dragger and whatnot. They flew around for a bit, and then after they landed, Eleanor, great, she said, well, I'm going to have to talk to the president about all this stuff and whatnot. But they had already approved the program before that ever happened. But at the same time, she was pretty much the conscience of the president. And I imagine, knowing Eleanor, she probably had some very honest and tough conversations with him about what should be done. In March of 1941, he decided and said, yes, there's no more arguing. We're going to train them. We're going to have one squadron, the 99, made up of 35 pilots and 27 aircraft started. And in July, they named the first class of cadets in 1941. There were 13 of them. And there were 12 college graduates, but one of them, the 13th, was a guy by the name of B.O. Davis Jr. He was a captain at the time, went to West Point, graduated in 1936. He was number 35 out of a class of 275. When you graduate that high, you can have your choice. He says, I want to become a pilot. They, are you kidding? No, that won't happen. So they told him no. So 5 years later, when they decided to train him, he was one of the 13. Let me tell you a few things about the Tuskegee Airmen. There were actually 15,000 Tuskegee Airmen, but only 900 pilots. But we have three bases. We had the training base down in Tuskegee. We had Godman Field, which was training twin-engine pilots. And then you had us, the fighter pilots, which was overseas. Now, out of the 900 pilots, only 355 of us went overseas to fight the war. Now, we can't keep track of 15,000 people. So they only keep track of the 355 that fought in the war. Out of those 55, there's now only 13 of us left. And I am next to the youngest guy. We just come back from Washington, D.C., where they invited 7 of us up. But the 7 of us can all travel. We're all mobile. So we're invited every place. Out of all these guys right here, they're all dead, but there's little Harold Brown, a little first lieutenant right there. and I'm the only one still living out of all these guys.
The 332nd knew they got hand-me-down planes from the other white pilots. Regardless, the P-51 Mustangs were their lifeline in combat. They were quick and maneuverable.
But if you notice, our 51s all got red tails on them. And we were the red tail fighter pilots. Now, all of the fighter groups that were flying, they all have their own colors on the back of the rudder. In the 15th Air Force, where I was flying out of, that was in Italy. We were flying from north to south, bombing all of the targets in southern Europe. We were the red tails. Another group of 51s was the yellow tails. Another group of 51s were the checkerboard tails. They had checkerboards. Another group was the candy stripe. They had stripes all over them. And the reason why that is, here you got all these airplanes flying. We're protecting all these bombers, but we're all assigned a certain group of bombers that we have to protect. And the bomber group has to know who their protectors are. So it's easy because they can, all they got to do is to look at the tail and they know precisely which fighter group is escorting them. Because there's a lot of airplanes when you go up on a mission like that. I'll give you a perfect example. The mighty 8th Air Force, which was over in England, flying from England east to west, they could put up 2,000 bombers and 1,200 fighters. That's 3,200 aircraft. Can you imagine that many aircraft flying in one day?
Easy, right? All it takes is to look at the tail to know who is friendly or not. But imagine how many planes could be flying at one time and you might change your mind.
Well, interesting enough, one day I was on a mission, 6 of us. We were escorting a photo reconnaissance aircraft, but they were unarmed and they were just carrying cameras because they're photographing the place. So they would send 6 fighters up to protect them. And this day we were going up and he said, "Look over there, you guys." And we looked on the horizon. The lead group was going over the horizon out of sight. And there were groups, and they were still coming up on this side of the horizon. And if you can imagine airplanes from horizon to horizon, it gives you some idea.
The Air Force and all the military at the time were still segregated, and prejudice rules were official policies. Even in Italy, the American generals enforced white and colored rules. There are stories that a white soldier would not salute a higher-ranking officer. Even in training, they were made to repeat exams and told their expectations would be tougher than their white counterparts. They knew to be accepted, they would have to be extraordinary.
Well, at first they didn't know. They had no idea who we were. But all they knew was this: who are those red-tailed pilots? Man, those guys really stick with us. Man, who are these guys? You know, and eventually they found out, oh, man, there's a bunch of black guys over here flying those airplanes. If you fly so many missions, you go on what they call rest and recuperation. We go back to Naples. We had a big, beautiful hotel right on the Bay of Naples. I could look across the bay and I could see Mount Vesuvius.
The Tuskegee pilots quickly gained recognition and respect of those they protected.
You must be one of those red-tailed pilots. Yeah. They got so they loved us. And like I said, they nicknamed us the Red-Tailed Angels. It got to the point where they were requesting us. Hey, a big dangerous mission. Who's escorting us today? Are the Red Tails escorting us today? No, we want the Red Tails. So the group commander renamed his airplane by request, and that was the name of his airplane.
Dr. Brown, living in the North, had a different experience than his fellow pilots from the South. He recalls that for him, as a person of color, things weren't that different for him.
I saw very little segregation. As a matter of fact, we lived just on the outskirts where the predominantly black neighborhood was. I recall so well there were Swedish people on this side of us. Across the street, there were a number of Polish families. Down on the corner of the block, there were Jewish families. right behind us, there were two families of Latinos. And this was our little small community. We went to Blaine School, and there was only 3 kids that looked like me in the school. Myself, my brother, and another kid by the name of Fred Kane, and his father was the only colored guy on the police department.
Even though life was better in the North for a person of color, discrimination could still be found.
Now, there were places, it's interesting, the Phyllis Wheatley Solomon House that they built. Any time that a number of the kids that would come up to go to the University of Minnesota, they could not live in the dormitories. So they would live at the Phyllis Wheatley House, and they had several suites on the upper floor of the Phyllis Wheatley House. There's a singer you probably have never heard of, Marian Anderson, who had an outstanding reputation, and she was invited to come up to Minneapolis for a recital. She stayed at the Phyllis Wheatley House because the downtown Nicollet Hotel said, no, we're not allow her in. Now, that didn't affect guys like me because we couldn't afford Nicollet's Hotel anyway, so it didn't make any difference to us. But there were a few places that did. But other than that, we were downtown, restaurants, theaters, shopping, anything that we wanted to do.
When Harold was accepted for training at Tuskegee, he was getting ready to make his trip to Alabama when his mom gave him some advice.
Let me tell you about my first trip south. After I got my papers and I was going down, now comes my mother. Harold, this is how you're going to have to behave. You've never been south before. Now listen closely to me, Harold. Ma, do I have to listen? Now listen to me, Harold. Don't be hard-headed. If you don't listen, you're going to go down and you're going to get yourself in all kinds of trouble. Now you listen to me. So she's telling me how I have to behave. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Be polite. Got into Nashville, Tennessee late at night, around midnight or so. So I walked up, to the ticket place and walked in. The gentleman. So I said, sir, can you tell me on which track the train for Biloxi, Mississippi comes in? He says, tell you what, he said, you go right around the corner there, and the man in the corner, around the corner, will take care of you. So I said, okay. So I walked around the corner to the next window, and the same guy walks up. I said, sir, can I help you? I said, what in the world? I said, sir, the same question. Can you tell me what track the train for Biloxi, Mississippi comes in? So he told me, and then as I walked away, I looked up, and there's a big sign, colored, white. I was at the wrong window. So that was my introduction to, so this is what Mom was talking about.
Helping to protect the white pilots and bombers helped them gain respect, but life at home was still the same.
So this is back in the early 40s. I went overseas, came back home, and it was still, in 45, the same old segregated society. In 1947, Truman was now president. In 1948, he announced he was going to integrate the military.
So life in the military was no longer black and white, but fully integrated, but that wasn't true everywhere.
When was the first Civil Rights Act passed? In 1964. 19 years later. So for those 19 years, I was integrated on base, but when I came off the base, it was total segregation. And that went on for my whole career. I retired in 1965. So during all my military life, I was integrated on base, segregated off base.
Harold was witnessing firsthand the changes of our country during a radical time, but what about today?
Even today, there's still some problems, but things are getting better and better. There was a good friend of mine who wrote a book. Charlie Dryden addressed it this way. He said his belief in that was all in one thing, that he said this country has the capacity to change, and as long as that exists, change will occur. And that is what Dryden addressed, which made an awful lot of sense to me. And this is true. We've seen changes.
Harold's life principles are to never quit, aim high, and keep moving forward. As long as we as a country do the same, we will continue to improve. He used these principles at an airbase in Italy to face every mission.
Normally, they wake you up at something like 5:30 in the morning. You're flying the mission, you jump on the truck, and you go down to the group briefing room. Here are all the pilots up there. A great big map was on the wall, and the group operations would stand up and brief you on the mission. And he's standing on a platform, and he's got this whole map about the size of this wall, and he's got a line drawn from where you're taking off to where you're going to meet the target at another line, what targets you're going to bomb up in Europe and so forth. Very impressive. You got a takeoff time. They tell you what your group that you were flying with, what the insignia on the tails of the bombers were, so you could identify them. We hear the bombers take off, and they would take off an hour before we were, because we were so fast, we would catch them. So they would take off, and we would see the bombers go over. We would line up on the field, and they would just start flagging us off, one after the other, until we took off 4 squadrons, which was usually anywhere from 60 to 70-some aircraft, just our group alone. We take off, fly formation, catch up with the bombers before they got in the enemy territory. Then after we caught up with them, that is when we start protecting. We have 1 squadron high, 1 squadron low, 1 squadron on this side, 1 squadron on this side of the bombers, and we would escort them all the way up to the bomb group. If we were going to be hit by enemy aircraft, they would do it before we got to the target, hopefully to shoot down as many bombers as possible so they couldn't bomb us. And that is when we would attack them, but only if they came in and attacked us. Because if you go off looking for victories, you leave a gap in the protection, and the enemy fighters can come in. So that was a no-no. You stay with your bombers. As a matter of fact, we did it so well that they started calling us the Red-Tailed Angels, because we stuck with the bombers. Up, over target, bring them, and we were bringing most of our bombers all back home, safely. But we did lose some, but not very many. And we probably had the best escort record of any fighter group during the war for that precise reason. B.O. Davis, the one who I mentioned early, the West Pointer, he was our group commander. He was Colonel Davis by that time. And he had one rule. I remember when I got overseas, he called us in, happy to have you gentlemen. We need pilots and yakety. He says, I got only one rule. And that rule is your job is to escort those airplanes, to stay with those airplanes, protect them, and get them home safely. If any of you ever leave the bombers going off looking for personal victories, you can shoot down 10 airplanes, but when you come back here, I'm going to court-martial you, and you'll never fly again. So, when the boss man spoke, we listened, and we stuck with the bombers.
Sticking to that mission was what made the Tuskegee have the best escort record than any other group, but not all missions went so well.
On my 12th mission, I had a run-in with an ME-262 jet, twin-engine jet, ran into him, such and such. Should have broke it off, went home, had fuel exhaustion, 25,000 feet, run out of fuel, and I crash landed the aircraft, tore it up, called in the base, and my commander just chewed me out. Oh, he chewed me out. Now, that was on my 12th mission. On my 30th mission is when I was shot down. On that one, we were strafing. Strafing missions are this. You're going after ground targets. The primary targets were locomotives. And we know that the big locomotives with all the boxcars and whatnot, they were all carrying military supplies, tanks, and whatnot. And those are the targets that we went after. And we would start and we would catch them and start right from the tail end and just walk right up. And then when you get up to the locomotive, you would hold your guns on it for another couple of seconds, and it would blow up and you would break off. Well, It was a lot of fun, but it was also very dangerous. I was on 6 strafing missions, and on every one of those strafing missions, I got a hole in one of my aircraft. Granted, it was a small hole, but the P-51, as it looks up there, that is a liquid cool engine, and it is cooled by a coolant. And if you break one of those lines and you lose your coolant, then that engine will immediately overheat, and it only runs for no more than 1 to 2 minutes, and it will freeze up and stop. And that's what happened to me. When I went in, I had the locomotive lit up, and I was just pulling up when it blew up. And some of the shrapnel and stuff from the explosion hit my engine. It knocked out my coolant line. My oil pressure went to 0, my oil quantity went to 0, and within a short while, all of the coolant came across the windshield. Once that happened, I knew I had it. I had to get out of the aircraft. So I just pulled the aircraft up, jettisoned my cockpit, rolled it over my back. You kick the stick forward and it throws you out. But I was at a low altitude and I had to get out in a hurry, and that's the fastest way to get out. Well, I pulled a chute and whatnot, and I landed okay. And the interesting thing was I was floating down in the chute. The guys, circled me, and I could see them sitting in the cockpit as they circled me. And I waved at them. They knew I was okay. But as I was in that chute and landing, I could hear those engines slowly fade and fade. And I was up there all by myself. And I said, what in the world? 20 years old, what am I doing up in Germany looking like this? I was picked up, and they brought me back to a village. And there were about 35, 40 people that met us as we walked in with the 2 guys, a constable, or the 2 policemen, really, who picked me up. Now, supposing you was in that little village, and I come over, and I'm strafing up the place. I'm not shooting at you, but I'm shooting the place up, and there's shrapnel flying around, and it hits your sister or your brother or whoever. And let's say it even killed them, whatnot. And if you saw me floating down in the parachute, what would be on your mind?
What was really amazing about meeting Harold is that in the midst of death and war, he has great empathy for even the enemy.
They were very angry. So we had a standard rule when we flew every mission. You never go down in the target area. Never if you can help it. If your airplane is damaged, you fly it as long as possible to get away from that area. For the simple reason you're dropping bombs and whatnot, and those people are angry. And if they see you coming down, they then become a mob. And once the mob gets you, they'll kill you. I didn't have time to get away. My engine broke. They caught me. They brought me back. I was met by 35 very angry people. And they were going to do one thing, kill me. So here I am, 20 years old. I'm trying to reconcile the fact that, Harold, you're going to die in a few minutes or so. No place to run. I can't hide. And as I reflect back on it, that had to be the scariest thing that I've ever experienced in my life. Fortunately, there was a good person in the crowd. There was another constable in the crowd. I saw him walk around. I felt a shoulder on me. He snatched me back. He steps in front of me, puts a round in his rifle, and he stops the people. We backed up into a little pub. We threw everybody out. We barricaded ourselves in there. They were pounding on the door, trying to get in. They couldn't get in. And this was in the wintertime, and as it got dark and later, the crowds finally started to disperse. Around midnight, we went out the back end, walked down to another village. He got on the phone and called someone, and a few hours later, a couple of soldiers come up with a truck and picked me up. Then from that point on, it was just a matter of traveling across Germany to the interrogation center. I was interrogated in Nuremberg.
During interrogation, whenever he was asked a question, he simply kept saying his name, rank, and serial number.
They always interrogated air crew. And why would they do that? I would fly a mission, come home. I would read the daily paper, the Stars and Stripes. I knew exactly what was going on. The poor ground guy is up here fighting on the ground for 30 days, 2 months at a time, whatever. He had no idea what was going on. He didn't have the pleasure of going back, reading the Stars and Stripes, listening to the radio to know how is the war going. He had no idea how the war was going. So they always took the air crew and interrogated them before they sent them to a POW camp.
During transport and entering the prisoner of war camps, one of the guards who spoke English told him and some fellow prisoners that the war wasn't going to last much longer and they shouldn't do anything stupid or try to escape.
The Americans were getting close, and keep in, the Americans are coming from the west, the Russians are coming from the east, and they're pinching us, and they keep moving the prisoners inland.
10,000 prisoners took 8 days with little or no food, finally arriving at Moosburg on April 18. 11 days later, an American general came to liberate all the prisoners of war who were oblivious to what was going on with the war. The Tuskegee fighter pilots will forever be remembered as playing a pivotal role in World War II Air Force. Since then, they have been recognized for their great accomplishments.
This is a picture of us in the rotunda of the Capitol up in Washington, D.C. And they gave the Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal. And there were 300 of us up here. Notice you got a lot of guys wearing red jackets. The red jackets was because we were red tails. And all the guys wearing red jackets are guys who have served overseas. And you can even see that is quite a mob. But you don't see, well, you see some red tails, but there's a whole lot of people there that are not red tails, are there? Because, again, there wasn't that many of us that went over to fight the war.
As they received the nation's highest civilian honor from President Bush, he gave an apology to one of the pilots.
And he says, I hope this makes up for all of the people who bypassed you and refused to salute you. Because that happened quite often. We were officers and other folks that didn't look like me would look at me, ignore me, and, I just didn't exist as far as they were concerned.
In '94, Harold still remembers what it felt like as a new fighter pilot that achieved his dream of flying.
We were young, crazy, invincible. Do you notice that all the generals are old guys, but all the fighters are young guys? Now, why is that? You're invincible. I'm invincible. I was the greatest pilot in the world. So you send these little young crazy guys out there to fight the war.
In reality, when you're flying in the sky in harm's way, you need to depend on each other, and a person's skin color is not even a part of the equation. One of Harold's favorite quotes is from General Chappie James. The power of excellence is overwhelming. It is always in demand, and nobody cares about its color. There is no doubt that the Tuskegee pilots were excellent, as you heard from the message of the Red Tails movie. Harold shared with us how the movie compared to real life.
Boy, you sure made us look good. Man, you were doing things that I wish I could do, but I don't think I could quite do it like that. He laughed. They had some conversation going on, and you never have conversation like that. You kept your mouth shut, and you kept the airways clear in case something happened, and there was important stuff that they have to get to you.
Even though it might not have been exactly like the movie, Harold had his share of fun in a plane.
Oh, I did my share of flips and whatnot. Yeah, I was, I had done a lot of crazy stuff. When no one was looking to come down over the runway 100 feet off the ground, rolled over on my back, and like I said, we were crazy.
After retiring from the Air Force in 1965, he had already earned his college degree and started teaching at a junior college, and later completed his PhD and became the vice president of Columbus Tech. Helping others to achieve their mission has continued to be a passion.
There's so many opportunities, And all I tell kids is stay in school. You gotta stay in school. Stay in school. Get good grades. A's and B's only. None of these C's and D's. I was doing what I loved to do. Flying became my passion. And I lived out my dreams. I dreamed to become a military pilot, and that's precisely what I did. You know, I talked to so many youngsters, and I said, don't limit yourself. Look at everything. You're young. Decide. When you decide something and you know that this is what you want, then you go after it and allow that to become your passion. There's an old saying that when you are working out in what is your passion, you'll never work a day in your life. Because when you're working your passion, that's not work. You're doing pleasurable things.